Good morning. We are the very last line of Kuf Aleph Amud Beis 101b. So that's going to be Kuf Aleph on the top, and you'll see two dots there. So what did we leave off with? We left off with a question on the view of Rav Sheshes. It was. Yes. And the question was as follows, or the dispute is as follows. When a person leaves the location of where they're eating, are they required to make a bracha on the food that they finished eating? And then when they eat again, are they required a new bracha when they eat again? Or is there continuity to the food, to their eating, and therefore the bracha continues and no reason to make a new bracha? This was the question. After we already established that new location means a new building, and from the same building, at least in Rashi's view, then it's one continuous eating, no need for a new bracha. But if you did move to a new location, so the dispute was, it depends on what you're eating. Shesha said it doesn't matter what kind of food you're eating. If you leave the location of your food, of your eating, you have to make a bracha before you leave. And when you come back, or if you decide to eat later in the other location, new bracha to begin with. Meaning after bracha and then beginning bracha, right? The bracha for the end of the meal. Okay. That was Rav Sheshes' view. Rav Huna, however, distinguished, or Rav Chizda, Rav Chizda distinguished between the kinds of food that halacha anchors you to the original spot. So the halacha says you are required to go back to your spot to finish and make your after blessing, your bracha achrona. If it's the kind of food that halacha requires you to come back, then even when you walked away, there's still continuity to your meal. You didn't really walk away from your meal yet because halacha is calling you back to come back to your spot to bench to do the after bracha. What kind of food would that be? Any food, which first of all is hamotzi, which you would have to do the full benching, or you're required to do it in the spot where you ate, but also any food that would require the miniature benching, not the bar nefashis, but what we call alamichya, what the halacha calls me'ein shalish, which is essentially any mizanat food and anything made of the 7 kinds from Israel. So olive, dates, figs, grapes, wine would require you to come back to the spot that you ate and make your after blessing.
Question. When you say dates, so let's say dates from Israel, but if you're eating dates, let's say from California.
Doesn't matter. If they're of the 7 kinds, yeah, dates are dates.
Dates are dates. It doesn't matter where.
It doesn't have to be from Israel.
Okay.
I remember, to the best of my knowledge, yeah. It's just the 7 kinds. Same thing with Mazonis. Right? Mazonis. Okay, Mazonis is different. But also Mazonis is different than wine is different. But not necessarily. Not necessarily because the grapes themselves come from the 7 kinds, and the wheat and the barley also are from 7 kinds, right?
Well, the wheat and barley falls under Mazonis.
Right, but that's part of its prestige is as part from the 7 kinds.
Okay.
Right, same thing with the wine. Although they have their own prestige on their own, which is what you're alluding to, but nonetheless, there's the prestige anchored to the fact that it's part of the 7 kinds. At any rate, I don't think it needs to be specifically from Israel, not the best of my knowledge. If yes, I've been making a mistake for a long time, for many years. So someone knows otherwise, correct me.
Somebody told me that it was a year ago or so, and he says, I've been making mistakes for so many years.
Send me a source if you have one. I'd be happy to be corrected.
Somebody told me this, and I was like, okay.
If you know that is, ask that person to send you a source. Okay, so again, Rav Shesha says it doesn't matter what kind of food you're eating. If you're walking away, you have to make an after blessing. And if you start eating again, you made an after blessing. It's a new meal. Make a new bracha again. Rav Chizda says, no. If the halacha anchors you back to the spot that you were planning on eating, because halacha says you have to make the after blessing in the spot that you ate, and even when you walk away, the kfiya kama kahadar, to his original sitting, he is returning. That's the halacha's language here. So he hasn't left really a spot, and therefore no new bracha over the new food. Okay, we challenge this. We challenge this because the Mishnah described a group of people sitting and drinking. And it says they were mesubin, they were settled into a drinking meal, right? And akru ragleyen, they uprooted their feet to go outside and greet a bride and groom that were on procession to their wedding. And this language, akru ragleim, they uprooted their feet, indicates that they were settled into the kind of thing that halacha would require them to come back for. And yet, the Mishnah said that if they leave behind a older gentleman or someone who's frail, someone who couldn't come out to greet the bride and groom, if they left someone behind, then that would anchor them back to their meal.
Is there a time frame?
When we get to the Shulchan Aruch, we'll get to that. When we get to the Shulchan Aruch, we'll get to that. So this Mishnah said that if they left someone behind, then when they walked out to greet the bride and groom, they would not be required to make a blessing after the food they finished. And when they come back, they wouldn't make a new bracha. So in this Mishnah, what's the factor that anchors them to their meal? The fact that they left someone behind. And the Gemara challenges, well, why is that? Seemingly, at least in Rav Chizda's view, the very fact that halacha requires you to come back is enough to anchor you to your meal. Why does the Mishnah insist that you have to have someone there at the meal the entire time, someone at the table? Clear on the Gemara's question? This is where we left off, yeah? Clear? Yes? Yeah. What anchors you to the meal? What anchors you to the original spot? Rav Chizda said the very fact that halacha calls you back anchors you to that spot. And therefore, even if everyone left the room, no need to make a new bracha because you're still anchored to the spot you ate because halacha requires you to come back. Whereas the Mishnah here said, if you all walked away, you would have untethered yourselves from your original location and would require a new bracha. Only if you left someone behind are you anchored to the original spot. So this is the question the Gemara is addressing. So, very, very, very last line on Kuf Aleph Amud Beis 101b. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman, son of Yitzchak, says, now top of Kuf Beis Aleph 102a. Man Tana. Who is the Tana? Who is the scholar of the Mishnah? Which Akiris, which is of the view that only if everyone walked away, you are untethered, even if everybody walked away, you're untethered, even if halacha tethers you. Right? That was the question. Let's make this clear. Rav Chizda is a sage from the Gemara's era. The text we quoted is from the Mishnah's era. Rav Chizda has to comply with texts of the Mishnaic era, considering that it predates him by decades, maybe centuries. What the Gemara is telling us now is that actually this question as to whether or not you require someone behind at the meal to tether you, or the halachic tethering is enough, that itself is a dispute from the Tanaic era, from the Mishnaic era. And therefore Rav Chizda could say, I don't follow that Mishnaic view, but I follow that Mishnaic view. That's what we're about to introduce. So specifically, who is the one in the Mishnaic era who's of the view that you have to have someone sitting behind to keep you tied down? Otherwise, you're disconnected. You need to make a new bracha. Who is that? Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda. It's a singular minority view. And Rav Chizda follows the majority view that says that so long as the halacha anchors you back, because the halacha requires you to come back to make your benching, that's enough. You don't have to have anybody behind. As per the majority view, which we're about to read presently. Clear? With me or not?
So, yeah, I don't understand the.
Yeah. Sorry? Go ahead, Alan. Yeah.
Matt, you sit down, you have a meal.
Yeah.
Okay, with 4 or 5 people. Right? 5 of them five of them, they all get up and walk away.
Yeah.
You're left alone.
Yeah.
You do the full thing.
No, but you're staying and waiting for them to come back. The person who got stuck behind is waiting for them to come back.
Yeah, what if they don't come?
Okay, so then they fail to do their halachic obligation of coming back to the bench in the spot that they're supposed to, right?
But it has no effect on you.
No effect on the person staying behind.
You still do
The effect is not on the person staying behind. The effect is the person who's staying behind has on the other guys who walked out. And those guys who walked out, they said, okay, we'll be back in 5 minutes. And they mean it, they will. So they go out to say hello to someone and they come back. So the presence of that guy staying there gives continuity to their meal because they're still coming back to the same meal and therefore they don't need to make a new bracha. Right? Rav Chizda said, you don't even need that. Even if everybody walked away, the very fact that the halacha requires you to come back is enough to keep you tied down to your spot. Right?
You're tied down.
Tied down, I mean like halachically connected. Not tied down, as in like you're staying in the spot. You're actually walking out. But you're tied down as in your meal is still continuous from the place you left because the halacha calls you back. Following? Yeah?
kind of like a compound question. I think one of the questions I already tried to address last week. The last person to comment on this process that we're going through right now is Rashi,
Not necessarily. Why?
because we're going back different eras, right? Now
Okay.
talking about.
The final ruling is going to be in the Shulchan Aruch. We'll get to that when we
Okay,
finish
so
the Gemara.
the final ruling in the Shulchan Aruch is from the Alter Rebbe.
The one we would follow, yeah.
Okay, so going back to, I think I addressed this last week. If I hear Kiddush in shul, let's say the rabbi makes Kiddush.
Yeah, we're not on the subject of Kiddush today.
I understand.
Okay, yeah.
I understand we're not on the subject of
Yeah.
Kiddush, but I hear Kiddush,
Okay,
and I'll now go to the rabbi's house and eat.
yeah,
But I heard Kiddush in shul,
yes.
and now I'm going into the rabbi's house to wash. And when I get to the rabbi's house, he'll ask, "Did everyone hear Kiddush?"
Yeah.
And then it's okay. Let's wash.
Yeah.
So I understand we didn't eat the meal yet, or we ate,
Yeah.
or we heard Kiddush and we ate Mazoinus, and now we're carrying the bracha over to
Which
the
bracha are you carrying?
Mazoinus and hearing Kiddush.
Mazonis and hearing Kiddush are not the same kind of bracha.
I understand, but I make Mazoinus after I heard Kiddush.
So again, we're talking about nothing to do with Shabbos.
Okay.
We're talking about eating in general.
Okay.
So the Kiddush is one issue. We discussed that.
Right.
Eating is another. We're talking about eating in general. So let's look at the cookie.
Okay. So
You change location, new bracha. Done.
But I didn't bench after the Mazoinus.
You should have.
Should have.
Yeah, you should bench after before you leave and make a new bracha when you get to the new place. That's the point of the halakha.
Okay.
New location, new bracha. The question is, when you're planning on coming back, did you leave your meal or not leave your meal? Is your meal over or not? And that would depend. Rav Chizda says the very fact that the halacha calls you back to bench is itself enough of a reason to say your meal is not over. This Mishnaic text said, no, the fact that halacha calls you back to bench does not make it into one long meal. You have to have someone sitting at the table there to keep it one long meal. And then when you come back, you're continuing because someone else was here the whole time, right? Yeah, that was the Gemara's question. Rav Chizda is saying you don't need to leave someone behind. And the Mishnaic text says you do need to leave someone behind to keep you attached to that original spot, right? Are we clear on all this, or yes? All right, we're talking about this is Tuesday. It's not Kiddush necessarily. We're talking about Birchas Hanenin, the bracha over eating food.
Okay.
Unrelated to Kiddush. Or yeah. Okay. So now what the Gemara is telling us is that actually this question as to whether or not you have to leave someone behind in order to halachically attach you to your original spot, and therefore no new bracha required because you're anyways still connected to your original meal, that whether or not you need to leave someone behind, that itself is a dispute from the Mishnaic era. And Rabbi Yehuda, as a singular view, is of the view that in order to consider your meal as having continued, and therefore when you walk away, no new bracha, you don't have to bench and so on because you're coming back, his view is you have to have someone behind, leave it left behind. That's a minority view. Whereas others say even if everyone walked away, so long as the halacha requires you to come back to the table where you ate, that itself is enough to make your meal continuous, and therefore no need to make a new bracha when you eat.
Does that person
Let's see.
you have to follow you with the same bracha? Let's say you can't read.
I'm not understanding.
Let's say the person eating with you
Yeah,
can't read.
nothing to do.
You
Nothing to do.
just sit and listen.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. Here's, again, the issue here is not bracha. The issue here is, are you at the same meal or not? Whether he can make a bracha or not is irrelevant. The point is he's there, and him being there tells me that I'm still at that meal because he's eating with him. So whether he can make a bracha, whether he can listen to my bracha, not relevant. The question here is the meal over or not? Is the meal over? And if the meal is over, bench and make a new bracha when you eat again. If the meal is not over, don't bench and don't make a new bracha again. How do I know if the meal is over or not? Well, presumably when you walk out the room, the meal is over. Well, says the Rabbi Yehuda, well, no, it's not over because you left someone behind at the table. Rav Chizda says, well, actually, it's not over because the halacha tells you to come back and sit down and bench. So whether that person is making the bracha or is answering amen to my bracha is not is immaterial. Separate issue. Okay, we got this clear on what we're dealing with. Is the meal over or not? So that's the question. What?
It's just that
I want to make this clear. Let's not try to find the conclusions now. We're not learning conclusions. So if you're thinking of what's the conclusion halachically, you're thinking wrong. No, hold on. Let me finish. Yes, but if you're thinking scenario, you're thinking wrong already. Because now you're trying to apply it. Mistake. We're learning the Gemara now. which means you have to understand the flow of the Gemara. What's the Gemara's question? What's the Gemara's proof? What's the Gemara's response? If none of that is relevant to any scenarios you will ever encounter, immaterial. When we get to the Shulchan Aruch, then I understand, but don't.
I'm going through a process.
But you make a mistake when you do that because you're taking the process in the wrong direction. You're trying to apply it to scenarios you're going through, and as opposed to trying to understand what is the Gemara telling me. So don't. If you're thinking about how do I apply it to what I'm doing, we're going off the wrong direction.
No. What I'm trying to understand is the process. Why is this question?
Because someone said something irrelevant to where you're going. You're saying
No, I'm not going. I'm going backwards. I'm trying to understand why.
Okay, I don't want to go through this now, but the point is,
let me suggest something.
Yeah.
What we're having is an encyclopedia of references. You're getting a whole story. Once you have the whole story, the whole story deals with, is there continuity or is there not continuity? And the whole thing is to first of all have all the encyclopedia of references, the dictionary of terms, and the gallery of portraits. So we want to get to a conclusion. You haven't got the encyclopedia of references yet. You haven't had, so no encyclopedia of references, no dictionary of terms yet, no gallery of portraits. When the whole thing is finished, then we can ask the questions
about the conclusions.
We're going
Thank
to
you,
the continuity of everything.
That's right.
The whole question deals with, is there continuity or is there not continuity? With regard to the blessings that are being made, with regard to somebody leaving, somebody coming. But what we need first is the entire picture.
Definition of terms.
Exactly.
What are the things we're talking about? And then we can apply them to our scenarios.
And when we hear the entire story, then we can have the questions because we have the encyclopedia of references, dictionary.
We know how to apply.
Portraits.
That's correct. That's right. So if we're that's right. So I understand the urge to want to get the conclusion, but it will undermine our learning.
No, I'm not looking for the conclusion. I'm trying to understand why was this question posed.
Because someone said something. Because someone said X fact and someone says X fact counter. That's enough. How that applies to what you're discussing is not relevant. He said X as a factor. He said X as a factor. How do we reconcile? That's it. Understand? We have to go into what they're thinking, not take what they're thinking into what we're thinking.
That's what I'm trying to understand, what they're thinking.
Right, but that's not relevant to whether you're in Sholem walking away or doing anything like that, right? It has to do with what did they say?
Right.
That's the question. Not don't apply it. What did they say? It's a critical when you're learning, especially when you're learning Gemara. Not to think. I mean, full stop. Not to think.
Until the end.
It's to listen. Listen. What is being said? I don't mean listen as to me. Even when you're reading a text and you're reading it out loud, don't think about the text. Listen to the text. And once you know what the text said, then you can ask about it. But if you haven't listened to what the text is saying and you asked about it, you're not going to get the answer to your question because you don't know what it says. So first, what are they saying? And then we'll see how it applies, if it applies, whether it applies. Maybe it's irrelevant to us. We'll find out after. But first we have to know, what is it saying? So right now the Gemara is dealing with a contradiction. Rav Chisda said X, the Mishnah said text said X. How do we reconcile the contradiction? Anything other than understanding what Rav Chisda said and what the contradiction is immaterial to our discussion.
Yeah.
Because now you're jumping to 10 generations later when they already went through all the things we just did and trying to figure out what their conclusions were. We're way too far ahead.
I have another suggestion.
Yeah.
But for example, it's like somebody's listening to a case. But this is a case they want to hear what everybody has to say. Very end, it's going to be, what are the solutions for all of it? And the only way we can have questions is if we know that there are solutions, but there are no solutions before we hear absolutely everything, in order to be able to respond later on to all the possible questions. But we still have to, it's like a whole case going on, and then you say, okay, now I see what A said, what B said, what C did. You have many parties in the case. And once you have all the parties together, what they had said, then you find what are the solutions that one can give to all of them within that scenario. This
is not a push at anybody here specifically. This is a mistake that I counter all the time, myself included. When I'm reading something, I start making associations with a bunch of things I know. Right. I'm like, oh, stop. Don't make associations yet. What did he say? You're going to miss something this person you're saying if you're making associations. Nothing to do with anybody here specifically. Everybody suffers from this, myself included, when you're reading, because you know a lot of things and you want to apply them and you want to connect them. It's a mistake to do that. Resist the urge until you fully comprehend what is said and then make the associations, connections, and so on.
That's why
okay, so let's go.
So helpful for everything in life is the fact that it teaches us, first of all, to have the art of active listening, then to have the art of active seeing. And then we can see that there's no paralysis of self-doubt, and we see what the questions are, because we've seen absolutely everything that could possibly come up. And then we have the questions based on the reference, the vocabulary of terms that we can use to ask the question.
Yeah. So good. So let's make that very clear then where we are. Rav Chisda said what connects you to your original meal, and therefore no requiring a new bracha, is the fact that the halacha calls you back. If halacha tells you come back and bench here, then when you walk around, you haven't left your meal yet. That's Rav Chizda's view. We had a Mishnaic text which said that's not enough. You have to have someone present at the spot where you ate originally, and that's what will keep you connected. And if when you walk around, you don't have to make a new bracha because someone's there. So which one is it? Do I need someone left behind? Or like Rav Chizda said, no, just the very fact that halacha calls him back is enough. This is the question. To which the Gemara responds, this very question itself is a Mishnaic dispute. And therefore Rav Chizda does not have to contend with Rabbi Yehuda's view, which is a minority view. He goes to the other view, which says, but so long as the halacha calls you back, that's enough to keep you connected to your meal and no new bracha. This is where we are. So let's read that. Top of Kuf Beis Amud Aleph 102a. The Tanya, if we've learned. Yeah, we clear where we're going?
Yeah, we're the judge. We're listening to.
Hey, there we are. Shahayim misubin va'akr lagleim leilech lebeis hakneses el beis medrash. So friends were sitting, and they uprooted their feet. Again, the same language. They were settled, and they uprooted their feet, which means they were at a meal. That's a permanency. They weren't eating a snack. They're eating the kind of food that halacha says you got to come back to eat. You got to come back to bench, which means in this case, the halacha tells them you got to come back. And here, everybody got up and went to the shul, or the beis medrash, or to the study hall. Right? And they are planning on coming back. But they went for whatever reason. We're not going to get into what the reasons they left for, because that itself is going to become a discussion in the Shulchan Aruch, whether they went to learn, whether they went to daven, what they're doing when they went. But they went for a few minutes and they're coming back. So says this text, when they leave, they don't need to make a bracha when they leave, because they're coming back anyway. Therefore, when they come back, their previous meal continues. They don't need to make a new bracha on the food they're about to continue eating. And this opinion gave no caveat that someone is left behind. The very fact that they're going to come back, and the very fact that they sat at a meal which the halacha requires them to come back to bench at, is itself enough to keep them connected, and therefore no new bracha required when they leave or when they come back, because it's still one long meal, notwithstanding the fact that they took a 3-minute, 4, 5, 10-minute break when they went to the shul. But Rabbi Yehuda in the minority here disputes and says, no, the medvar mamurim, when can I apply this ruling? That the meal continues even when they walk away, is man she'indichu sham miktzas chaverim, when they left behind some of the members of the group. But if they did not leave behind some of the members of the group, so everybody left, even though the halacha itself requires them to come back. Rabbi Yehuda is of the view, if everybody left, your meal is over. And if your meal is over, when you leave, you have to make a bench, you have to bench, you have to make the after blessing. When you come back, you have to make a new bracha on the food you're going to continue to eat. So here we have it. We have a dispute going back to the Mishnaic era as to what is needed in order to keep the meal going and therefore require no new bracha. Either the very fact that halacha tells me to come back, as per the Tanna Kama, the original sage, which said even if everybody walked out, the very fact that halacha says, hey, come back to bench, that itself indicates your meal is not over. And therefore, you don't have to bench when you leave because you're coming back. And you don't have to make a new bracha when you come back to eat because you never left, even though you left. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda said, no, you have to leave someone at the table. At least someone at the table that anchors you all back there. And therefore, when you come back, no new bracha. But if everybody left, you'd have to make a new bracha. This is the dispute, and Rav Chizda is following the majority view.
You have to leave with an intention of coming back?
Yes, that's clear. Because if you walked away, period, then you walked away, period. Here, the halacha is, you, as far as you're concerned, you're continuing your meal. The question is, does halacha consider what you just thought as actually continuing your meal? That's the question. Yes, but that's a good point. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. The assumption here is you know you're coming back. Yeah. Which we'll get to that also in the Shulchan Aruch, like various different details as to which point did you step away from your meal. Like if you said Rabbi Yisrael rebel and benching, but then no one else decided to answer, you put it down. Did you just end your meal? And would you have to make a new bracha when you pick up that glass of wine? We'll get into all of that. Okay.
What if my intentions is to come back, but I don't?
Okay, so again, we'll get to that, but what kind of food did you eat? Does the halacha require you to go back or not? If the halacha requires you to go back, then go back and bench. If the halacha doesn't, bench in your spot. Right? That's the kind of food we're talking about here. That's the question of what kind of food is this?
I made a mudsi. and my intention is to come back,
you still have to go back to that spot and bench. That's the halacha, right? That's the whole point here. We're talking about what kind of food is it?
right?
Is it the kind of food that the halacha requires you to come back and bench? Bread is one such food, which means you'd have to come back and bench in that spot. That's the whole question here. So, and Chisda would say, so much so that the halacha calls you to come back to bench, that if you came back to your spot and you decide you want to continue eating, you don't have to make a mitzvah again. Because you never left, because the halacha tells you to come back, even though you walked away. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda would say, no. If you want to come back and eat again, you got to make a new hamaitzi. Unless someone was there the whole time, and that person anchored you to your meal. Yeah, clear? That's exactly the discussion here. So now the Gemara is going to get to the rationale behind this, and we'll conclude with that. The rationale behind this dispute. And this is what we've been explaining the whole time. And the reason here is when we're talking about the kinds of food that the halacha requires you to come back to bench for, the bread, the mezainis, the wine, all the stuff from the 7 kinds, where the Torah says the halacha says you have to come back to your spot and bench. Therefore, the kishein yotzin, when they walk out, because the halacha is expecting them to come back. So when they walk out, ein tunim bracha lamafreya, they don't have to bench right now, because the halacha anyways tells them to come bench. So because the halacha anyways tells them to come back and bench, their meal isn't over, even though they're walking away. And therefore, when they do come back, and they're going to continue drinking their wine or continue eating their challah, they don't need to make a new bracha on that food. Because the entire time, the halacha considered as if they were still connected to the spot of their eating, because halacha is waiting for you to come back and bench. But the kinds of foods that you don't have to come back to your spot and bench, like a cup of coffee. If you walked away from your coffee drinking and you forgot that you didn't bench, you do not have to come back and make a bar nefashos. You make a bar nefashos wherever you are. So the halach itself says, when you walk away from your drinking coffee, you're not connected to the spot. You walked away, it's over, it's done. And therefore, afilu l'rabbanon, even the sages who said you don't need to leave someone behind at the meal, but when it comes to a coffee or something that the halacha doesn't attach you back, kishein yotzin, when you leave, tunim bracha l'mafrei, you should really bench before you leave because you're done drinking. And kishein chayzin, and when you go back to drink, of course, tunim bracha l'chatchila, you have to make a new bracha to begin with. Okay, so let's explain now what the Gemara just did. The Gemara just added an overlay to the 2 principles, right? We have 2 principles here. One principle is what kind of food you're eating, and the other principle is, does the halacha attach you to it? Okay, so we had one view, which is Rabbi Yehuda, that said you're only attached to the original spot if you left someone behind. So that's clear. Unless someone's left behind, you're not attached to the original spot. Shelf that. The other view, the sages / Rav Chisda, which says if the halacha attaches you to the spot, right, then the halacha attaches you to the spot, then you are connected to the spot, you don't have to make a new bracha. Right? Which means, therefore, now, what did the Gemara just add here? If you're doing the kinds of things that I'm sorry. Right, okay. The Gemara just clarified. The Mishnah just said, if you are sitting and established at your meal and you walked away to the Beis Medrash, you don't have to make a new bracha when you leave and when you come back. To which the Gemara clarifies and says that this is specifically talking about when there's a halacha tethering to your spot. And therefore, if you're drinking something that the halacha does not tether you to your original spot, you're eating something that the halacha says you can bench anywhere, even the sages, who don't ordinarily require someone to be at the meal to hold you back, they will agree here that because the halacha doesn't attach you, it's as if you walked away, you have to bench and you have to make a new bracha again. Clear? This is where we are right now. Yeah. So why is the Gemara going through this exercise? Because, says the Gemara, this is going to be a refutation to Rabbi Yochanan. Anybody remember what Rabbi Yochanan said? I'm introducing Kiddush, but only incidentally. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who said that if you heard Kiddush in Shul and you go home, not only are you exempt from making Kiddush because you heard Kiddush in Shul, but you're actually exempt from making Hagafen because you heard Hagafen in Shul. Rabbi Yochanan's view is that if you go to a new location, no need to make a new bracha. He was in the minority view, and we already rejected him. But the Gemara here, it says, here's another rejection. Because here, the sages, even the sages who say that you don't need someone at the table to tether you to the original meal, but they still believe that you have to have some connection to the original spot because the halacha tells you to come back. If that's the case, then Rabbi Yochanan, who says you never have to come back to a spot, you go to a new location, no new bracha because you're still at your original meal, even though you went from shul to home. No new hagafen. Is this not a refutation to Rabbi Yochanan's view? Says the Gemara. To which the Gemara says, didn't we already reject him once? We have to reject him again. We already rejected him, right? We rejected Rabbi Yochanan's view earlier. Says the Gemara, let this also be a rejection, double rejection. So tomorrow we're going to do something very interesting, and this gets to the point that you were talking about earlier. The Gemara is not going to, what the Gemara is going to do tomorrow is defend Rabbi Yochanan's view against this Mishnaic text, even though there's another one that already rejected him. What's the Gemara doing? It gets back to our original point here we were talking about earlier, that the Gemara wants to understand what is everybody saying. Even though we already rejected Rabbi Yochanan's view, we're not taking it halachically. It's not going to apply to anything we ever learned because we rejected his view. But now the Gemara introduced a second rejection. The Gemara is going to go through a whole mental exercise to defend him against the second rejection, even though the original rejection still stands. Why? Because we have to know what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Even though it's not going to be relevant to the halacha per se. So this is where we're going to go tomorrow, God willing, to defend Rabbi Yochanan's position. And the conclusion we have is the sages, the majority view that if the halacha, ordinarily new location means new bracha, that principle still remains. Unless the halacha ties you to the original spot. If the halacha says you have to go back to bench, then no new bracha when you leave, because hey, you still have to go back to bench. This is where we are at the moment. As opposed to Rabbi Yehuda's view, which says, even if the halacha anchors you to your spot, not enough, you have to leave someone behind. On the other extreme, you have Rabbi Yochanan who says, doesn't matter at all. You can go to a new place and continue eating, make no new bracha at all. And that's the rejection we just introduced, to which we have to defend at least this new rejection we'll introduce. That we'll do tomorrow, and then we will go to the Shulchan Aruch. So you want to get the conclusions? It's coming, God willing, the second half of tomorrow's class, because it's going to be very quick to Rabbi Yochanan's resolution, and we'll go straight to the Shulchan Aruch, and then come back to the halachas of Kiddush. Yeah, what do you want to ask?
11 lines down.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 11. Yeah.
So you have 11, 12, and 13. You have ain, she'ain.
Yeah.
So when the person who's typesetting all this, he's starting from the first page.
Yeah.
How does this come together that you have 11, 12, and 13? The last three words are one on top of another the same.
They're very, very similar phrasing, so it's going to happen here a lot. Because if you want to know exactly what we're looking at dvarim items, hatunim that require bracha, a blessing, or dvarim items, she'ain, that do not require bracha. So it's going to be the same, because we keep going back and forth. What kind of food are we talking about? We're talking about the kind of food that requires a bracha after, or doesn't require in the spot.
No, I understand.
So the words are going to be coming again and again.
I see this, and I'm like, when the person put together the typeset, and is
It's actually relevant because it's not immaterial, because it's relevant because that itself would cause every now and again misprints. Because you have the same words repeated again and again. The typesetter doesn't necessarily understand what he's typing. He's just copying words on a page, right?
right.
And he missed your eyes look at the line and the text there while you're typing, and it looks at the wrong line, and he adds a shin or removes a shin.
Okay.
That does not, or that does, changes it right there, right? That happens quite often, and sometimes scholars will break their heads over a text and say, we must conclude there's a misprint, and then they'll start digging up older prints or prints in other locations to see if there's another variant. That happens quite a bit. And when you see a little, some of the little asterisks actually take you to the side, where it tells you, hey, there's a misprint here, and it's print. If you look at the print from Venice in X year, it's printed a little differently, and sometimes that has significant change in halacha, especially when words get repeated that are very similar but not exactly the same.
Right.
So that's a significant issue, but not for us because
I-
modern scholars certainly have gone through the laborious effort of looking at different prints to try to get the most accurate possible. But the truth is, Rashi's era, the Rishonim themselves, a big part of their scholarship was doing this, was looking up variant texts. And quite often you'll see Rashi will say, this is the incorrect text. I found a text that should be the other way. It should be written this way, it should be written that way. It's, quite often we'll find that. Even going back, it was 800 years, 900 years, where the scholars are already doing that, trying, because it's the first time they're out of Babylonia. When you're in Babylonia, all the texts are right there. When you're out of Babylonia, you're trying to study the text that came from Babylonia, you look at something, you're like, oh, maybe there's a misprint here. So travel to somewhere who someone has another print that he bought from Babylonia, maybe it's a bit different. It's not print, it's manuscript actually, not even print, manuscript. And maybe this manuscript was the copyist got it wrong. So this was already in the Rishonim era, a big study. A big part of what they did was to try to exactify the text of the Gemara. Okay, wonderful day, Yidden. So God willing, we're going to be getting to halacha throughout this week. So please stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of very interesting details that are going to be very practical and relevant for everything. For the meals we have here, the meals we have at home, the sandwich we eat in the car, the coffee you drink at your desk and walk around your office while you're drinking it, all this stuff is going to come up, and these are very common daily occurrences. So I encourage you to stick around for the next week or so.
Believe it or I'm gonna miss a lot of it.
Sorry?
Believe it or I'm gonna miss a lot of it.
Well, either you'll listen to it online. When you come back Wednesday next week, you'll be fully prepared and follow what we're talking about. Okay, wonderful day.
I'll do the very best to you. Thank you
Yeah.
for with all the travel yesterday that you came in late and you
Yeah,
left
Baruch Hashem for Simchas.
and you still